The sound of metal striking metal echoed through the small blacksmith shop in Czerwona Góra. It was the spring of 1943, and in this rural village in central Poland, a 21-year-old man named Henryk Strąpoć was building something that should have been impossible. On his workbench lay parts that did not belong together. A barrel from a rifle used in the last war, hand-cut and rebored. Stamped metal pieces smuggled from a factory 50 kilometers away. Springs fashioned from scrap, a trigger mechanism that existed only in his memory of stolen glances at German soldiers' weapons. He was building a submachine gun. Not a crude pipe weapon, not a single-shot improvised firearm. A fully functional automatic weapon with selective fire, a safety mechanism, and a closed-bolt design that would not be replicated by professional engineers for another 25 years. He was doing this in a village blacksmith shop under German occupation, with muscle-powered tools and no formal engineering education. He had never held a submachine gun in his hands. He had never seen technical drawings. He had only watched, from a distance, as German patrols passed through the village with their MP-40 submachine guns slung over their shoulders. He would memorize what he saw, return to his shop, sketch the shapes from memory, and try to understand how the mechanism worked. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The weapon Henryk was creating would come to be called the Bechowiec, named after the peasant resistance fighters who would carry it into battle. Only 13 would ever be completed before the front lines approached and forced production to stop. Only one survives today, preserved in the Polish Army Museum in Warsaw. But the story of how this weapon came to exist reveals something profound about desperation, ingenuity, and the impossible, things ordinary people can achieve when their survival demands it. This was not supposed to be possible. Young men from rural villages were not supposed to design automatic weapons. Blacksmiths working with hand tools were not supposed to machine tolerances precise enough for a functional firearm. Resistance fighters under German occupation were not supposed to manufacture weapons in workshops where Gestapo patrols passed regularly. Everything about what Henryk Strąpoć was attempting defied reasonable expectation. Yet he had been preparing for this moment, in a sense, for years. At 15, he had built his first semi-automatic pistol, copying a Belgian Browning that a relative had shown him. He had examined it, disassembled it in his mind, and then recreated it by hand in his shop. The local police had confiscated it and warned him never to do it again. By the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, he had built 3 more pistols and a revolver, each one an illegal act, each one evidence of a mind that understood machines in ways that formal education could not teach. Now, with his country under occupation, with German forces controlling the metalworks in nearby Ostrowiec Świętokrzyski, with Gestapo informants everywhere and summary executions for anyone caught with weapons, Henryk was attempting something far more ambitious. He was attempting to arm the resistance. He was attempting to build, from nothing, the kind of weapon that professional armories struggled to produce. He was attempting the impossible. And somehow, against every reasonable expectation, he was succeeding. The question was not whether he could do it. The spring prototype on his bench proved he could. The question was whether he could do it more than once, whether the resistance could produce these weapons in numbers that mattered, whether peasant farmers and village blacksmiths could become an armory. The answer to that question would depend on factors far beyond Henryk's control. To understand what Henryk Strąpoć was attempting, you must first understand the Poland he lived in. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded from the west. 16 days later, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Poland, caught between 2 totalitarian powers, was destroyed as an independent nation. The country was divided. The Germans took control of western and central Poland, including the region where Henryk lived. What followed was not merely military occupation, it was systematic destruction. The German occupation of Poland was designed, from the beginning, to be different from the occupation of France or Belgium. Those were military occupations of countries the Germans saw as culturally related. Poland was different. Nazi racial ideology designated Slavic peoples as inferior, suitable only for slave labor or elimination. The occupation reflected this belief. Polish schools above elementary level were closed. Universities were shut down. Teachers, priests, and intellectuals were arrested and shot. The goal was clear. Poland would cease to exist, not just as a nation but as a culture. The land would be cleared of Poles and resettled with German farmers. The people would be reduced to an illiterate labor force, or simply killed. In Henryk's region, in the Kielce voivodeship of central Poland, this policy took brutal form. The Zamość area to the south, chosen for its fertile black soil, became a test site for German colonization plans. Starting in late 1942, Polish farmers were forcibly expelled from their land. German settlers moved in to take their farms. Children deemed suitable for Germanization were separated from their families and sent to Germany to be raised as Germans. Those not suitable were sent to labor camps or murdered outright. Thousands of Polish farmers lost everything: their land, their homes, their children, their lives. The response to this terror was organized resistance. By early 1941, various underground groups had formed across occupied Poland. The largest was the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army, which by 1944 would number over 300,000 members. But there were others. The Bataliony Chłopskie, the peasant battalions, was formed specifically to defend rural Poles against German economic exploitation and forced expulsions. It grew from small self-defense groups in mid-1940 into a substantial force. By summer 1944, it would have 160,000 members organized into 70 units across occupied Poland. These resistance organizations faced a fundamental problem. They had people willing to fight. They had motivation. What they did not have was weapons. The Polish army had been destroyed in 1939. What weapons remained were hidden or buried. Captured German weapons were rare. Allied supply drops from British aircraft brought some equipment, but never enough. The British Sten gun, a crude but functional submachine gun, was sometimes included in these drops, but the supplies were irregular and insufficient. The Bataliony Chłopskie in Henryk's area had almost no automatic weapons at all. They had rifles, mostly old hunting weapons. They had pistols, a few of them. They had explosives they could make from fertilizer and stolen components, but in any engagement with German forces, they were hopelessly outgunned. German patrols carried MP-40 submachine guns. German soldiers had machine guns, mortars, artillery, and armor. The resistance had courage and local knowledge, and nothing else. This was the world Henryk Strąpoć inhabited in 1943. His country had been erased. His culture was being systematically destroyed. His region was designated for ethnic cleansing. The resistance organization he had joined needed weapons and had no way to acquire them. And so a 21-year-old blacksmith with 6 years of elementary education decided he would build them. Not one weapon, not a few. He would design a weapon that could be produced in series, manufactured in secret workshops, and distributed to fighters who needed it. He would do what no armory in Poland could do. He would arm the resistance from nothing. Henryk Strąpoć was born in 1922 in Czerwona Góra, a small village in the Świętokrzyski region of central Poland. His family were peasants. His formal education ended after 6 years of elementary school. He was, by conventional measures, completely unqualified to design anything, let alone a complex mechanical weapon. But conventional measures did not account for whatever existed inside Henryk's mind. From childhood, he was obsessed with how things worked. He would take apart tools, study mechanisms, understand the relationship between components. He had what later engineers would call spatial intelligence, the ability to visualize three-dimensional objects and understand how they moved and interacted. He had something else too, a photographic memory, the ability to look at something once and retain the image with perfect clarity. These gifts, combined with access to his family's blacksmith shop and an apparently fearless disregard for authority, made him dangerous in ways the German occupation had not anticipated. At 15, in 1937, he built his first pistol. He had examined a Belgian FN Browning model, 1900, that belonged to a relative. He disassembled it mentally, understanding the blowback mechanism, the trigger group, the magazine feed. Then he went to his shop and built one by hand. No lathe, no milling machine. Hand tools and a forge. When he demonstrated it to classmates in a ravine behind the village, the school headmaster caught him. The police confiscated the weapon. They threatened him with jail. Only his age saved him. He was a juvenile, a first offender. They warned him never to do it again. He built 3 more guns before the war started. 2 more semi-automatic pistols and a revolver, each one illegal, each one evidence that formal education was not required to understand engineering principles. When Germany invaded in 1939, Henryk was 17 years old with a criminal record for illegal weapons manufacturing. Under occupation, that criminal record transformed into resistance credentials. The skills that had gotten him in trouble with Polish police made him valuable to the underground. He joined the local unit of the WWII Chłopski. The resistance needed a gunsmith. In early 1943, the Opatow district headquarters of the WWII Chłopski approached Henryk with a request. They needed submachine guns. They had almost no automatic weapons. Every engagement with German forces left them outmatched. Could he build one? Henryk had never held a submachine gun. He had never seen the inside of one. He had only observed German soldiers carrying MP-40s, but he thought he understood the principle. A submachine gun was, essentially, a scaled-up automatic pistol. It fired pistol cartridges from a simple blowback mechanism. It was not a complicated machine, just a complicated machine to build with no factory and no tools. He set to work. What he created, over the following months, was remarkable, not for its beauty, but for what it revealed about improvisation under impossible constraints. He based his design on Browning-type blowback pistols, the mechanism he understood best. He created a closed bolt, hammer-fired action, a design approach that professional engineers would not widely adopt until Heckler and Koch developed the MP 5 decades later. He did this not because he was advanced, he did it out of ignorance. He did not know that submachine guns were supposed to fire from an open bolt. So he designed what made sense to him based on the pistols he had built. And it worked. The prototype was complete by spring 1943. It was crude by factory standards. The metal was stamped rather than machined. The finish was rough, but it functioned. It fired 9mm parabellum ammunition, the same cartridge used by German weapons, which meant ammunition could be scavenged from captured supplies or enemy dead. It had selective fire, semi-automatic or fully automatic. It had a safety. It worked reliably. The prototype proved the concept. Now came the impossible part, producing these weapons in numbers that mattered. Henryk could build 1 submachine gun in his blacksmith shop working alone. To build dozens, he needed infrastructure that did not exist. He needed precision parts that required machine tools he did not have. He needed a supply chain under German occupation. He needed workers who would risk execution if caught. Somehow, he found all of it. Jan Swat was a draftsman who worked at the metalworks in Ostrowiec Świętokrzyski, 50 kilometers from Czerwona Góra. Before the war, the facility had been called Huta Ostrowiec. Under occupation, the Germans had renamed it Hermann Göring Werke and converted it to production for the German war effort. The factory employed hundreds of Polish workers, all under German supervision, all subject to German security protocols. Jan Swat was also a member of the resistance, using the nom de guerre Orzel, which meant eagle. When Swat saw Henryk's prototype, he understood what it meant. This weapon could be manufactured. Not easily, but it could be done. He prepared technical drawings for every component, converting Henryk's rough sketches into proper engineering specifications. Then he approached other resistance members who worked in the metalworks. They would manufacture the parts in secret, on German machines, under German noses, during shifts when German supervisors were not watching closely. It was insane. It was also their only option. The system they created was elegant in its simplicity. Workers at the ATA, Hermann Göring Werke, would produce components during regular shifts, a few pieces at a time, nothing suspicious. The parts were small enough to hide, a spring here, a trigger guard there, stamped metal pieces that could be anything. Starting in October 1943, these components were smuggled out of the factory. Workers would hide them in lunch pails, in clothing, in bags of tools. They would carry them past German guards at the factory gates, one piece at a time, one day at a time. The accumulation of tiny acts of resistance that, collectively, became an armory. The parts went to Henryk's blacksmith shop in Czerwona Góra. The shop was small, equipped with muscle-powered tools, a forge, a few hand files and drills. Everything about it spoke of 19th-century metalworking. Nothing suggested modern weapons manufacture, which was precisely the point. German patrols passed through the village regularly. They saw a blacksmith shop. They saw horseshoes and farm implements. They did not see the parts hidden carefully away, the components waiting for assembly. The barrels presented the greatest challenge. A barrel requires precision. It must be straight, rifled correctly. The chamber must be properly dimensioned. Modern armories use specialized machinery. Henryk had scrapped rifle barrels from the First World War, mostly 7.9mm Mauser rifles. These had to be cut to length, then hand-bored to 9mm diameter. He did this with hand reamers and patience. Each barrel took days to complete. Each one had to be tested. Some split during test firing. Some proved inaccurate. The ones that worked became barrels for Bechowiec submachine guns. Assembly was Henryk's responsibility alone. He would fit the parts together, hand-filing components until they worked properly. The slide had to move smoothly. The trigger mechanism had to function reliably. The safety had to engage correctly. Modern firearms factories have test fixtures, measuring tools and quality control protocols. Henryk had his hands and his judgment. When a weapon was complete, he test-fired it in an isolated area, then delivered it to resistance contacts. Each gun was marked on the left side with SHW 44 Strąpoć Henryk, pattern 1944. On the right side, B.H. for Battalion Chłopski, though the C was missing because Henryk's brother's letter punch set was incomplete. These markings were all the documentation that would ever exist. The first two Bechowiec submachine guns were completed in January 1944. Through the following months, production continued at an agonizing pace. Every component had to be smuggled. Every assembly took days. Every completed weapon represented hundreds of hours of labor and enormous risk by dozens of people. By July 1944, 11 weapons had been completed in Czerwona Góra. At least 2 more were finished in Jan Swat's workshop in Bechowiec. Perhaps 20 more were, in various stages of assembly. Then the war came to them. In July 1944, the Soviet offensive was pushing German forces westward across Poland. The front lines that had been hundreds of kilometers away were now approaching the Kielce region. German units retreated through the area, setting up defensive positions, conducting searches for partisans and weapons. The Hermann Göring Werke increased security. German military police intensified patrols in rural villages. The small window of relative freedom that had allowed clandestine production was closing rapidly. The resistance made a decision. Production must stop immediately. The risk was too great. German forces moving through the area would search buildings. They would interrogate workers. They would execute anyone found with weapons or components. The unfinished Bechowiec parts, perhaps 20 weapons worth of components, were carefully hidden, buried in some cases, concealed in walls and under floorboards, scattered to locations where they might avoid discovery. Most would never be assembled. The moment had passed. The 13 completed weapons were distributed to Battalion Chłopski units in the Opatow area. Fighters who received them were trained in their operation. The slide, unusual for a submachine gun, had to be pulled back to chamber the first round. The selector had 2 positions, up for semi-automatic fire, down for fully automatic. The weapon fired from a closed bolt, which meant it was more accurate than typical open-bolt submachine guns, but required more careful handling. Ammunition was 9mm parabellum for most weapons, though the last 3 or 4 were chambered for 7.62mm Tokarev, the Soviet cartridge, in anticipation of Soviet forces arriving with supplies of that ammunition. The Bechowiec weapons that reached resistance fighters performed as designed. They were reliable. They functioned in conditions that would have disabled more delicate weapons. They gave peasant fighters automatic firepower in engagements where they had previously been limited to rifles and pistols. But 13 weapons could not change the character of the war. 13 submachine guns distributed across resistance units that numbered in the thousands made no strategic difference. The mathematical reality was inescapable. The Hermann Göring Werke, during the same period these 13 weapons were being manufactured in secret, was producing thousands of components for German military equipment. The factory that unknowingly supplied parts for 13 resistance submachine guns was simultaneously, knowingly, producing vastly more material for the German war machine. This was the fundamental problem that improvised resistance production could never solve: scale. A village blacksmith, working with smuggled parts, could build weapons one at a time. A modern armory could build thousands. The gap between what was needed and what was possible remained vast. The Bechowiec represented what desperate ingenuity could achieve. It also represented the limits of that achievement. Henryk Strąpoć had done something remarkable. He had designed and built a functional submachine gun under conditions that should have made it impossible. He had created a production network that operated under German occupation. He had armed resistance fighters who had no other source of automatic weapons. And it was not enough. It could never have been enough. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By August 1944, Soviet forces had pushed through the region. The German occupation was ending, replaced by Soviet occupation. The battalion Ichwopski faced new decisions about whether to cooperate with Soviet-backed forces or maintain independence. The weapons production that had seemed so important months earlier was now irrelevant. The war was moving on. The industrial powers were deciding the outcome, with factory production measured in millions of units. The 13 Bechowiec submachine guns, products of incredible effort and risk, became footnotes. Most would be lost in the chaos of the war's end. Some were captured by Soviet forces. Some were destroyed. Some simply disappeared. Only one survives. It sits in the Polish Army Museum in Warsaw, behind glass, a testament to what one person with limited resources and unlimited determination can create. The museum label identifies it correctly. Bechowiec, one submachine gun, designed by Henryk Strąpoć, manufactured 1944, one of approximately 13 produced. But the label cannot convey what that weapon represents about the nature of resistance, about the relationship between individual ingenuity and industrial capacity, about what is possible and what is merely symbolic. The story of the Bechowiec is often presented as inspirational, and in some ways, it is. A young man with no formal engineering education designed a functional automatic weapon. He created it from scrapped parts and stolen components. He organized a production network under enemy occupation. He succeeded where failure seemed certain. This is remarkable. It is also, ultimately, a story about the limits of remarkable individual achievement in industrial warfare. Consider the numbers: 13 weapons completed, perhaps 20 more partially assembled before production stopped. Compare this to professional armories. The British Sten gun, a crude submachine gun designed for resistance use and rapid production, was manufactured in numbers exceeding 4 million units during the war years. The German MP-40, the weapon Henryk observed and tried to understand, was produced in over 1 million units. Even the Polish resistance, operating under occupation, managed to produce approximately 600 Błyskawica submachine guns in underground workshops in Warsaw, using somewhat more sophisticated manufacturing capabilities than Henryk had access to. 13 weapons, 4 million weapons. The disparity reveals something fundamental about modern warfare. Individual genius matters, determination matters, but industrial capacity matters more. A factory operating for one day produces more than a blacksmith shop can produce in a year. A nation with intact industry defeats a nation without it, regardless of the courage or skill of individual fighters. This is not a moral judgment, it is mathematical reality. The German occupation of Poland demonstrated this principle with brutal clarity. The Wehrmacht deployed millions of soldiers equipped with modern weapons produced by functioning armories. They had aircraft, tanks, artillery, all products of industrial manufacturing at scale. The Polish resistance had courage, local knowledge, and improvised weapons. The outcome was never in doubt. The resistance could harass, sabotage, gather intelligence, and impose costs on the occupation. They could not defeat it, not because they lacked will or skill, but because they lacked factories. Henryk Strąpoć's achievement was genuine. At 21 years old, with elementary education and no access to technical libraries or engineering expertise, he designed a closed-bolt, hammer-fired submachine gun. He solved problems that professional engineers struggled with. He created a weapon that functioned reliably. He did this using hand tools in a blacksmith shop while under occupation. This demonstrated extraordinary capability. It also demonstrated irrelevance. The war would be decided by nations that could produce weapons by the millions, not by blacksmiths who could produce them by the dozen. After the war ended, Henryk returned to ordinary life. He attended a mechanical school in Sławięcice, finally receiving formal technical education. He was awarded the Krzyż Partyzanki, the Partisan Cross, for his resistance work. He lived quietly in rural Poland. When journalists found him decades later, he would describe, with considerable enthusiasm, the weapons he had built and the techniques he had used. But he also understood what his work had meant in the larger context. It had been symbolic resistance, important for morale, important for demonstrating that occupation was not complete control, important for showing that ordinary people could fight back, but not important for the war's outcome. That had been decided by factories in Detroit and Gorky and Birmingham producing weapons at rates that made handmade production meaningless. The single surviving Bechowiec in the Warsaw Museum represents this tension. It is historically significant as evidence of improvised resistance production. It is technically interesting as a demonstration of what a talented amateur could achieve without resources. It is materially irrelevant to the war's outcome. 13 submachine guns, no matter how cleverly made, could not compete with millions of factory-produced weapons. The mathematical disparity was too great. The industrial advantage was too overwhelming. Individual brilliance, when confronted with industrial capacity, simply cannot bridge that gap. This is what Henryk Strąpoć's weapon proves. Not that remarkable things are impossible, that remarkable things are insufficient. When the war ended in 1945, the resistance fighters who had carried Bechowiec submachine guns faced a new reality. Poland was not liberated. It was simply occupied by different forces. The Soviet Union, having pushed German forces out, established control over Poland through a communist puppet government. Resistance fighters who had fought the Germans now had to decide whether to accept Soviet domination or continue fighting. Many members of the WWII chose resistance. They had not fought for 5 years to replace one occupier with another. This decision had consequences. Soviet security forces arrested resistance members. Some were executed. Some were sent to labor camps in Siberia. Some simply disappeared. The weapons they had carried, including the few Bechowiec submachine guns that remained, were confiscated or hidden. The official history being written by the new communist government had no place for peasant resistance movements that had refused Soviet control. The WWII were formally dissolved in September 1945, though some members continued underground resistance into the late 1940s. Henryk Strąpoć survived. He was 23 when the war ended. He had spent his late teenage years and early 20s building weapons under occupation, risking execution every day. Now he faced peacetime in a country that was not truly free. He enrolled in a mechanical school in Sławięcice, finally receiving the formal technical education he had never had access to before. The young man who had designed submachine guns by intuition and observation now learned proper engineering principles. One wonders what he thought, sitting in classrooms learning the correct way to do things he had already accomplished incorrectly but successfully. He was awarded the Krzyż Partyzanki, the Partisan Cross, for his wartime resistance activities. This recognition came with complications. The communist government that awarded such honors was the same government arresting his former comrades from the Batalioni Chłopskie. Accepting the award meant accepting the legitimacy of a regime many resistance fighters considered another occupation. Refusing it meant remaining unmarked in official history. His achievements unrecorded. Like many who had fought in the resistance, Henryk navigated this impossible position by living quietly, accepting the recognition without embracing the regime. He remained in rural Poland throughout his life. He worked as a mechanic and farmer. He married, raised a family, lived the ordinary life that the war had interrupted. Journalists and historians eventually found him decades later. He would talk about the weapons he had built with the enthusiasm of someone describing a fascinating technical problem. He would explain, in detail, how he had observed German weapons and reverse-engineered their mechanisms, how he had created the closed-bolt design without knowing it was unusual, how he had solved the barrel-boring problem with hand tools. He seemed to regard it all as an interesting engineering challenge rather than a desperate act of resistance under mortal threat. In interviews conducted in the 1970s, he still remembered exactly how to build grenades and landmines, offering detailed explanations that responsible journalists declined to publish. His mind had retained every detail of improvised weapons manufacture. The technical knowledge that had made him valuable to the resistance had never left him. But he lived in a time and place where that knowledge was dangerous. Poland, under communist rule, had no use for men who knew how to arm resistance movements. So Henryk kept his knowledge, shared it cautiously with historians and researchers, and lived out his years as a rural mechanic who happened to have once designed weapons. The weapons he had built were gone. Most were lost during the war's final chaotic months. A few may have been captured and examined by Soviet forces. Some may have been destroyed by their carriers when capture seemed imminent. One, somehow, made its way to the Polish Army Museum in Warsaw. Whether it arrived there through official channels or was donated later by someone who had kept it hidden for decades, the records do not clearly indicate. But it survived, the only physical evidence of what Henryk Strąpoć had accomplished. The Bechowiec that sits in the Polish Army Museum in Warsaw is not in original condition. It has been polished, removing the black paint that covered production weapons. This was done to prevent corrosion, a sensible conservation decision that unfortunately erased some of its historical authenticity. The weapon that Henryk delivered to resistance fighters was crude-looking, painted black, marked with his stamps but showing the rough finish of hand manufacture. The weapon in the museum is shinier, cleaner, easier to display. It looks less like what it was, a desperate improvisation, and more like what museums prefer, a properly finished artifact. But even polished and preserved, the weapon tells its story. The markings are still visible. SHW 44 on the left side, BH on the right, the misspelling that resulted from a missing letter punch. The mechanism is intact. The slide that functions like a pistol slide, unusual for a submachine gun. The hammer-fired closed-bolt design that would not appear in professional weapons until decades later. The hand-cut barrel that shows tool marks from the reaming process. Every detail speaks of improvisation, of making do with what was available, of solving problems without proper tools or materials. Museum visitors who see it, if they notice it at all, among the more prominent weapons on display, generally do not understand what they are looking at. It is labelled correctly. The information card provides basic facts, but facts do not convey meaning. To understand what this weapon represents requires understanding the context in which it was created, the occupation, the resistance, the peasant battalions with no weapons, the 21-year-old blacksmith who decided he would arm them, the factory workers who smuggled parts, the months of labor that produced 13 weapons, the mathematical futility of building weapons by hand when the war would be decided by millions of factory-produced arms. The weapon is unique in firearms history, not because it was particularly effective, but because it should not exist at all. Young men with 6 years of elementary education do not design submachine guns. Blacksmith shops do not produce automatic weapons. Resistance movements under occupation do not create functional armories from scrapped parts and stolen components. Except this one time, in this one place, all of those impossible things happened. The weapon in the museum is proof, but it is proof of a specific kind of impossibility. Not the impossibility that cannot be overcome, but the impossibility that, even when overcome, changes nothing. Henryk succeeded. He built his weapons, he armed resistance fighters, and the war's outcome was not affected in any measurable way. The German occupation continued until Soviet forces pushed them out. Poland remained occupied, just by different forces. The fighters who carried Bechowiec submachine guns were not significantly more effective than fighters with other weapons. 13 automatic weapons distributed across thousands of resistance members made no strategic difference. The mathematics remained implacable. Individual achievement, no matter how remarkable, could not overcome industrial disparity. This is why the Bechowiec matters historically, not because it changed anything, but because it demonstrates what happens when it does not. Resistance movements produce heroic stories. Individual fighters display remarkable courage. Improvised weapons represent desperate ingenuity, and none of it matters at the strategic level because modern warfare is decided by industrial capacity. The side with functioning factories defeats the side without them. The side that can produce weapons by the millions defeats the side that can produce them by the dozens. This is not inspiring. It is simply true. The museum piece sits behind glass, carefully preserved, properly labelled. It is one of the rarest firearms in the world. Only one example survives from a production run of 13. It is also one of the least significant firearms in that same museum. Other weapons on display were produced by the millions and used in battles that shaped the war's outcome. The Bechowiec shaped nothing except the lives of the few who built it and carried it. The story of Henryk Strąpoć and the Bechowiec submachine gun is told sometimes as inspiration. Look what one person can accomplish. See how ingenuity overcomes limitation. Understand that determination can defeat impossible odds. These are comforting narratives. They are also, fundamentally, dishonest. The true lesson of the Bechowiec is considerably less comforting, but considerably more important. Individual achievement, no matter how remarkable, cannot overcome systemic disadvantage in industrial warfare. Henryk did something genuinely impressive. At 21, with minimal education and no resources, he designed a functional automatic weapon. He solved engineering problems that professional designers struggled with. He created a production network under enemy occupation. He delivered weapons to fighters who desperately needed them. All of this is true. Also true is that it made no strategic difference whatsoever. The war was decided by factories in America producing 49,000 Sherman tanks, by Soviet factories producing 58,000 T-34 tanks, by British factories producing 118,000 aircraft, by German factories trying desperately to match this production and failing. The Bechowiec represents the limit of what individual brilliance can achieve when confronted with industrial reality. 13 weapons, built over months, each one representing hundreds of hours of labor and enormous risk by dozens of people. Compare this to the Willow Run factory in Michigan, where Ford built B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of 1 per hour at peak production. 1 bomber per hour, each bomber vastly more complex than a submachine gun, each one rolling off an assembly line operated by workers who had been building cars 2 years earlier. That is industrial capacity. That is what wins modern wars, not blacksmiths building weapons by hand. This is why the story matters. Not because it is inspiring, but because it reveals something we would prefer not to acknowledge. In conflicts between industrial powers and non-industrial forces, The outcome is predetermined. The non-industrial side can produce heroes, can demonstrate courage, can achieve remarkable individual victories. None of it changes the fundamental mathematics. The side with factories wins. The side without them loses. Henryk Strąpoć proved this as definitively as any battle casualty report. He did everything right, achieved something that seemed impossible, and it was strategically meaningless because he was competing against systems that produced weapons at rates his improvised workshop could never approach. The Polish resistance, of which Henryk was one small part, numbered over 600,000 people by summer 1944. They conducted thousands of operations. They killed German soldiers, destroyed infrastructure, provided intelligence to Allied forces, and demonstrated that Poland had not accepted occupation. They were brave. They were determined. They were ultimately irrelevant to the war's outcome. Poland was liberated by Soviet armies equipped with millions of weapons produced in Soviet factories. The resistance contributed, certainly. But the contribution was marginal. The war was decided by production capacity, and the Soviet Union had it while the Polish resistance did not. We return to that blacksmith shop in Czerwona Góra in spring 1943. A young man striking metal, building something impossible, creating a weapon from scraps and determination. He succeeded. The weapon worked. It was adopted by resistance fighters. And in the larger calculation of the war, in the balance of forces and industrial production that determined the outcome, it registered as nothing, zero strategic value. The mathematics were too stark. The industrial disparity was too great. Individual genius could not bridge that gap. This is what the Bechowiec teaches. Not that impossible things cannot be achieved, that impossible things, even when achieved, are not enough. The farmer built his impossible weapon from scraps, and it changed nothing. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.